I still remember the first night I met Jason Hart. It was one of those unusually quiet nights in Redstone Canyon, where the winding highways seemed to hum with their own secret rhythm. The stillness of the place always had a calming effect on me. That night, the stars stretched endlessly above us, the crisp Colorado air brushing against my face as I leaned against my patrol car. It was the kind of moment that made you feel like you were the only person alive in the world. Jason was a senior officer, well known for his charm and sharp instincts. I'd heard his name tossed around the precinct enough times to paint a picture of someone larger than life, someone untouchable. So, when he pulled up beside me during one of my shifts, his patrol car casting a halo of light onto the asphalt, I was caught off guard. "Quiet night, Blake." His voice carried a friendly warmth, but there was an edge of curiosity behind it. "Too quiet," I replied, offering him a small smile. Almost eerie. Jason stepped out of his car, his silhouette outlined by the headlights. He leaned against the hood of my car, close enough that I could see the faint lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He was older than me by a few years, but there was something youthful in his demeanor, an energy that made you want to lean in and listen. "You're still new to the quiet out here," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness around us. "Give it a few more months and you'll start craving it." I laughed softly, the sound strange against the backdrop of silence. "I doubt that. I like the chaos." His smile widened, a flicker of amusement sparking in his eyes. "Then you're in the wrong town." That night, we talked for hours, our voices low as if the stillness around us demanded reverence. He asked me about my life, my reasons for joining the force. I told him about my daughters, about the divorce that had left me scarred but determined to rebuild. He listened intently, his gaze steady, as if my words were the most important thing in the world. In return, he shared bits of his life, his wife, Laura, their 3 kids, and the pressures of balancing family with the demands of the job. It wasn't just the words he spoke, it was the way he said them, the way his voice softened when he mentioned his children, the way his shoulders tensed when he talked about the distance that had grown between him and Laura. I didn't realize it at the time, but that night marked the beginning of something neither of us could have predicted. There was a vulnerability in Jason that mirrored my own, a quiet understanding that drew me in. It was nothing more than camaraderie, a shared moment between 2 colleagues. Or so I told myself. But the way he looked at me as we said our goodbyes lingered in my mind long after his taillights disappeared into the night. The days turned into weeks, and Jason and I found ourselves crossing paths more often. It started innocently, brief conversations during shift changes, shared cups of coffee in the break room. There was an ease between us that I hadn't felt with anyone in a long time. He had a way of making the world feel smaller, less daunting, even if just for a moment. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I found myself sitting in the precinct's parking lot, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. Jason appeared out of nowhere, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand. "Thought you could use this," he said, his voice gentle. I accepted it with a grateful smile. "You're a lifesaver." He leaned against the hood of his car, his expression thoughtful. "Long day." I nodded, blowing on the coffee before taking a sip. "Sometimes it feels like it never ends." His gaze lingered on me, a flicker of something unspoken passing between us. "You know," he said softly, "you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." I didn't know what to say to that. His words caught me off guard, piercing through the walls I'd so carefully built. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not just as a mother, not just as an officer, but as a person. That night, as I drove home, I replayed his words in my mind. There was a warmth in my chest that I couldn't shake, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to feel in far too long. The shift from friendship to something more was subtle, almost imperceptible. A lingering touch on my arm, a shared glance that lasted a second too long, a smile that felt meant for me and me alone. We never talked about it, never acknowledged the line we were beginning to blur. But it was there, growing stronger with each stolen moment. One evening, during a late patrol, Jason and I found ourselves parked side by side on a quiet stretch of highway. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the landscape. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question startled me. I turned to look at him, his profile illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. "I mean, sometimes it feels like the person I'm supposed to be and the person I am don't align. Like I'm trapped in a role I didn't choose." His words hit too close to home. I thought about the life I'd left behind, the sacrifices I'd made, the dreams I'd abandoned for the sake of survival. "Yeah," I admitted quietly. "I know exactly what you mean." Our eyes met, and in that moment, the unspoken truth between us felt impossible to ignore. The air was heavy with tension, a mix of fear and longing that neither of us dared to act on. But as the weeks turned into months, that tension only grew. It was like trying to hold back a storm, knowing that eventually it would break. And it did. It happened on a night like any other, quiet, unassuming, the kind of night that could lull you into believing nothing significant would ever happen. But life has a way of sneaking up on you, catching you off guard when you least expect it. Jason and I had been partnered for a late patrol, something that had become routine over the past few months. We drove in comfortable silence, the radio humming faintly in the background. The streets of Redstone Canyon were deserted, the only signs of life the occasional flicker of a porch light or the rustling of leaves in the wind. "I think this place spoils us," Jason said, breaking the silence. "Back when I first started, we didn't get nights like these. It was chaos all the time." I glanced at him, his face partially illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard. "And you miss it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But not as much as I used to." The conversation drifted, as it often did, to safer topics. Work, the weather, the best coffee spots in town. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension, a gravitational pull that neither of us could ignore. We stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, a place we'd been to a handful of times before. The waitress greeted us with a knowing smile, sliding 2 steaming mugs of coffee onto the counter before we even had to ask. "You two must live on this stuff," she teased, her southern drawl as warm as the coffee. Jason grinned. "Keeps us sharp." I laughed softly, wrapping my hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into my skin, grounding me in a moment that felt far too ordinary for what was to come. It was just after midnight when we decided to call it a night. The drive back to the station was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. But when we arrived, Jason hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. "Walk with me," he said, his voice softer than usual. I nodded, curiosity tinged with something I couldn't quite name. We stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of our boots crunching against the gravel breaking the stillness. He led me to a bench just outside the station, where the glow of a nearby street lamp cast long shadows on the pavement. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I waited, my heart pounding in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "I think about you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should." The words hung between us, fragile and heavy all at once. My breath caught, and I looked at him, searching his face for something, hesitation, doubt, regret. But all I saw was sincerity. "Jason," I began, but the words faltered. What could I say? That I thought about him too? That every stolen glance, every fleeting touch, had left me longing for something I knew I shouldn't want? He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "I know this is complicated. Hell, it's more than complicated. But I can't pretend it's not there anymore." My chest tightened, a mix of fear and desire swirling inside me. "You have a family," I whispered, as much a reminder for myself as it was for him. "And I love them," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "But that doesn't change how I feel about you." The honesty in his words was like a punch to the gut. I wanted to run, to put distance between us before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Instead, I whispered the truth I'd been denying for months. I think about you too. The silence that followed was deafening. His eyes searched mine, and in that moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. The weight of everything we stood to lose loomed over us, but it wasn't enough to stop what happened next. He leaned in, his movements slow, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was like a dam breaking, months of restraint and longing spilling over in a rush of emotions too powerful to contain. The kiss was brief, almost hesitant, as if we were testing the waters of something forbidden. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. I couldn't help it. Neither could I. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and quiet confessions. We became masters of subtlety, careful not to let our colleagues catch on. A lingering glance across the precinct, a brush of fingers as we passed in the hallway, a shared laugh that lingered a second too long. To anyone else, it might have seemed innocent. But to us, it was everything. We started meeting outside of work, always in places where we wouldn't be recognized. Redstone Canyon became our sanctuary, its winding trails and secluded overlooks offering a refuge from the judgmental eyes of the world. It was there, surrounded by the beauty of the Colorado wilderness, that we let our guard down completely. Jason was different when we were alone, softer, more vulnerable. He spoke about his fears and frustrations, the cracks in his marriage that had grown into chasms over the years. I listened, my heart aching for him even as I knew I shouldn't. In return, I shared pieces of myself I hadn't shown anyone in years. I told him about the nights I spent lying awake, worrying about my daughters, about whether I was doing enough, being enough. He listened without judgment, his presence a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. But the closer we became, the harder it was to ignore the reality of what we were doing. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder that our happiness came at the expense of others. "Do you ever think about what happens if we get caught?" I asked him one evening as we sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the canyon. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time," he admitted. "But I can't stop. Not now." Neither could I. The line we crossed that night on the bench wasn't the last. But with every step further into the gray, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something we couldn't come back from. As the weeks turned into months, the line between right and wrong blurred beyond recognition. What started as fleeting moments of connection turned into something far more consuming. Jason and I lived in a world of secrets, a delicate web of lies that grew more tangled with every passing day. At work, we maintained the facade. I became adept at keeping my emotions in check, wearing a mask of professionalism even as my heart raced whenever he entered the room. Jason, too, was careful, his demeanor with me no different than with any other colleague. But behind closed doors, the walls we had built to protect ourselves crumbled. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Jason suggested we meet at the Overlook in Redstone Canyon. It was one of our usual spots, quiet, secluded, and far away from prying eyes. The air was cool and crisp, the setting sun casting the canyon in shades of gold and crimson. I arrived first, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound as I made my way to the edge of the overlook. When Jason arrived, his expression was heavy, his usual composure replaced by a weariness that made my chest tighten. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping closer to him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Laura and I had a fight," he admitted. "She's been asking questions, noticing how much time I've been away." Guilt stabbed through me, sharp and unforgiving. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know how our actions were unraveling the life he had built with her. Instead, I placed a hand on his arm, offering what little comfort I could. "Jason," I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "I don't regret this," he said firmly, his gaze locking onto mine. "I can't." His words should have brought me comfort, but instead, they filled me with a deep, unshakable unease. What were we doing? What kind of future could we possibly have when everything about us was built on lies? I turned away, my arms wrapping around myself as I stared out at the canyon below. The wind whispered through the trees, a sound that felt both soothing and accusatory. "Maybe we need to stop," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the breeze. Jason stepped closer, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "Do you mean that?" I didn't answer right away. My heart and my head were at war, one screaming for me to run while the other pleaded for me to stay. Finally, I turned to face him, the conflict etched into every line of my face. "I don't know," I admitted, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I can't keep doing this." His expression softened, and he reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek. "I'm not ready to let you go," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't lose you, Sarah." And just like that, the resolve I had been clinging to shattered. I fell into his arms, burying my face against his chest as the tears came in earnest. He held me tightly, his own breathing uneven, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us disappeared. But deep down, I knew this wasn't sustainable. The cracks in our secret world were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The first sign of trouble came a few weeks later. One of our colleagues, Officer Ramirez, made an offhand comment during a shift change, his tone light, but his words laced with something sharper. "You two sure spend a lot of time together," he said, his eyes darting between me and Jason. Jason brushed it off with a laugh, but I felt the blood drain from my face. Ramirez didn't say anything else, but the look in his eyes told me he'd noticed more than we wanted him to. After that, the whispers started. They were quiet at first, easy to dismiss as paranoia. But as the days went on, it became clear that people were talking. The way they glanced at us when they thought we weren't looking, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when we entered the room, it was impossible to ignore. Jason tried to reassure me, his confidence unshaken. "They don't know anything," he insisted one night as we sat in his car, the windows fogged from the cold. "They're just speculating." But speculation was enough to plant the seed of doubt, and doubt had a way of growing into something far more dangerous. The breaking point came during a routine morning briefing. Chief Harrison, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, addressed the room with a sharpness that set everyone on edge. "I've been hearing things," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled officers. "Rumors about inappropriate relationships within this department." My stomach dropped, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. Jason sat beside me, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. Harrison's eyes lingered on us for a fraction of a second too long before moving on. "Let me be clear, this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. If anyone has information, now is the time to come forward." The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on all of us. I avoided Jason's gaze, afraid of what I might see there. After the briefing, I hurried out of the room, my heart pounding. Jason caught up with me in the hallway, his hand gripping my arm. "Hey," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing around us. "We'll get through this." But I wasn't so sure. By the end of that day, the whispers had turned into accusations. Ramirez, emboldened by Harrison's words, confronted Jason in the locker room, his voice loud enough to carry down the hall. "Why don't you just admit it?" he said, his tone sharp. "Everyone knows what's going on between you two." Jason's response was calm, measured, but it did little to quell the storm that was building. The damage was done, and there was no turning back. I went home that night feeling like the walls were closing in. The life I had fought so hard to rebuild was crumbling around me, and I had no one to blame but myself. I loved Jason. I couldn't deny that. But love wasn't enough to shield us from the fallout of what we had done. It wasn't enough to undo the pain we had caused, the trust we had broken. And it wouldn't be enough to save us. The days following the confrontation in the locker room were some of the longest of my life. The air at the station was thick with suspicion, every glance from a colleague carrying the weight of unspoken accusations. Jason and I had worked so hard to keep our relationship hidden, but the cracks in our facade were too deep to ignore now. I kept my head down, focusing on my work with a single-minded intensity that left little room for anything else. But no matter how hard I tried to lose myself in the routine, the whispers followed me, clinging to my every step like shadows. Jason, ever the optimist, insisted we could weather the storm. "It'll blow over," he said one evening as we sat in his car, parked in a dark corner of the station lot. His hand rested on mine, his touch warm and steady. "People love to gossip, but they'll move on to something else soon enough." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could still hold on to what we had, that the world wouldn't tear us apart. But the doubt was there, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Things came to a head during a routine shift briefing. Chief Harrison stood at the front of the room, his expression unreadable as he addressed the team. "I've received multiple complaints about conduct unbecoming of this department," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "This isn't just about policy, it's about trust. And if there's one thing this department cannot afford, it's a breach of trust." His words hung in the air, each one landing like a hammer blow. My chest tightened, a sinking feeling taking hold as his gaze swept over the room. When his eyes landed on me, I felt exposed, as though he could see straight through me to the secrets I had tried so hard to hide. Jason's expression was unreadable, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. He sat rigidly beside me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his confidence, the doubt that mirrored my own. That evening, Jason and I met at our usual spot in Redstone Canyon. The setting sun bathed the landscape in hues of orange and gold, but the beauty of the scene did little to soothe the unease that lingered between us. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice breaking the heavy silence. The words felt like glass shards in my throat, each one cutting deeper than the last. Jason turned to me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "It's tearing us apart. It's tearing everything apart." His expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "Sarah, don't do this. Don't let them win." "It's not about them," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "It's about us. About what we've done." He reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I love you," he said, the words carrying a weight that left me breathless. "I don't care what they say. I don't care what happens.